Today's Lunch and Learn is an impossible task because I've been asked to share a little bit about who were Stevens and who were Smith. And that is a big question with a lot of complicated answers. And I'd like to talk to you in about 25 minutes or so and have you eat your lunch and not overwhelm you. So I'll do my best, but understanding that this is really geared toward kind of a general audience who maybe doesn't know very much about Stevens and Smith, and also acknowledging that we have in the audience today people who know a ton about Stevens and Smith, more than I do, people who have written books on Stevens or Smith, and including this one behind me by Mark Kelly, which you can purchase conveniently in our museum store on Lydia Hamilton Smith. This is really just to get your appetite whet, and then I hope you'll continue the journey with us. Okay, I tried to share my screen, and I see that I have to share just this sort of strange one. So here it is, and then hopefully it'll share normally from here. Okay. Who were Stevens and Smith? The way we're going to do this is I'll talk to you about who was Stevens, and then I'll talk to you about who was Smith. Their lives also overlapped, and so it's tempting to want to talk about them together as well. I'll do a little bit of that, but for the most part, these will be sort of short and hopefully entertaining bios on both Stevens and Smith in their own right. So Thaddeus Stevens lived from 1792 to 1868. He was a state legislator, a federal legislator. He was a lawyer. He was an uncle and raised two nephews who were orphaned in their childhood. He was a friend to many other curmudgeonly lawyers in Lancaster that you'll meet in a few minutes. And he was a radical abolitionist. He supported ending slavery by any means necessary. He supported equality and changing the Constitution to make a more equal nation. And ultimately, in the end of his life, he helped bring about and author the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution, which provided emancipated enslaved people throughout the country, promised equal protection under the law and citizenship rights, and gave voting rights to men of color. So he was a very impactful and important congressperson and human, and somebody that most Americans don't know much about. And that's one question is why. That's a question I won't quite answer during this presentation, but look forward to thinking about it a little bit more and encourage you to think about it too. So here's Stevens' place of birth, somewhere over the mountain here in Danville, Vermont, on the early American frontier, just a year after the state became a state, the state of Vermont. So this is really the beginning of our new nation. It's, to put in context, George Washington is finishing his first term as president. The French Revolution is ending, and France is about to overthrow their monarchy. And Mozart is probably the equivalent of the Billboard Top 100. He's a popular composer during this time period. So just hopefully just gives you the sense that this is the promise of the new nation, of democratic ideals, of rethinking kind of the role of democracy and equality in the world, and really a time where people were still very much embracing the Enlightenment and kind of the ideals of that classical thought. So this is the context that Stevens is born into, and he's born to a family that was not wealthy. They were on the rural Vermont frontier. His father left the family, abandoned the family when Stevens was a child, and his mother was left to raise Stevens and the rest of his siblings by herself. And so, you can think about this beginning of Stephen's life as a time that probably shaped who he became as a legislator and a lawyer. And I'll be interweaving kind of his own thoughts and words throughout this, as well as Smith's. That he's saying here that he's grateful for being born into poverty because it allowed him to, as he said, sympathize with the misfortunate and understand kind of the plight of various minorities and other downtrodden people, from Black people to women to people with disabilities, etc., people without money. He also was born with a disability, a club foot. This is his boot that we have in our collection at Lancaster History that'll be on display at the Stevens and Smith Center. And that is a scientific illustration from the time period of one way that the clubfoot disability might manifest, which seems to be pretty much the way that Stevens' foot looked with based on the boot. So he was born with a disability, which automatically set him up as kind of a different different in childhood, and unable to help with the family farm, which was especially a problem after his father left the family. So luckily he had well, let me say that also I think this disability, in addition to kind of his rural upbringing and poverty, helped him become the man who believed in equality. Every man, no matter what his race or color, has an equal right to justice, honesty, and fair play with every other man, and the law should secure him these rights. It's a powerful statement on a lot of levels and foreshadows Stephen's commitment to the law that came later in life. But it seems to me that having a disability was a contributing factor to his feeling that we needed to uplift the theory of equality and enshrine it in laws to protect minorities. He was raised after the father left, in large part by his mother, Sarah, who sacrificed everything since he could not work on the farm, and neither could his brother, who also had, in fact, 2 club feet. She moved her family to Peacham, Vermont, where she had other family members who helped support them. And she worked. She worked as household staff, cleaning houses, and sacrificed greatly to be able to put her son Thaddeus Stevens through school. And he went to Peacham Academy, a tuition-based school in Vermont. And then he was able to go to the University of Vermont, and then Dartmouth is where he graduated from. So she really took this guy who was born into sort of poverty and obscurity in rural frontier Vermont, and enabled him to, through education, uplift himself and carve out a really wonderful future, a really extraordinary life. The education that Stevens received informed his values as well, and helped him understand that education was essential for both enabling people to have the careers and sort of life trajectory that they would like to have, but also for creating an informed populace. He really believed that people had the right to participate in their own government, but he also really believed that in order to participate in government, a cornerstone need would be education. You have to be educated in order to be an effective citizen, in his mind. And he was committed to education, public education, throughout his life. And from the minute he became a state legislator at the State House in Harrisburg, he championed the idea of free public education in the state of Pennsylvania. It was the second state after Vermont to institute free public education, and as they were threatening to take that away, as the House of Representatives in the state was threatening to take it away. Stevens made a very impassioned speech about the benefits of education and helped save public education in Pennsylvania. In 1816, Stevens traveled from Vermont to Pennsylvania and taught for a year, studied for the law bar exam, passed the bar, and established his own law practice in Gettysburg. And this is what Gettysburg looked like in 1870. So you can only imagine what Gettysburg looked like in 1816. It was a small, it was a town. It wasn't the middle of nowhere, but it was sort of, relatively small and not a populous city or a major legislative hub. But Stevens quickly established himself as a very successful lawyer. He gained kind of notoriety and respect in the community, and before long was the top earning lawyer in Gettysburg. He was also quickly involved in politics, first as an anti-Mason, a member of a political party called the Anti-Masonic Party. The Anti-Masonic Party was mostly dedicated to being against Masons. If Thaddeus Stevens was one thing, it was anti. He was anti-establishment, anti-racist, anti-sexist, and an anti-Mason. And basically in this time period, the very beginning of this political party emerged as a real reaction to the elite Freemasons and the fact that a smaller percentage of kind of elite, wealthy men would have undue control over institutions, over the American government. So this political party rose up initially to kind of push back against elitism and against, kind of wealthy white guys having all the say. So middle-class white guys decided they'd like the say instead, and Stevens was one of them. And so he was an active member of this party while it lasted, which wasn't very long. And then he transitioned to become a Whig, which was what most anti-Masons did after the party kind of collapsed. And he also funded this newspaper, the Anti-Masonic Star and Banner. So he realized in the power of the press to kind of sway people's political opinions. And so that was something he did in addition to lawyering and being part of the state legislature. This is an article in that paper that I'm fairly certain is from Stevens. It's signed an anti-Mason, but it really sounds like Stevens. And this sort of sums up, I think, the appeal of the anti-Masonic party to him. All mankind are under a paramount moral obligation to do as much good to the rest of mankind as they have the means and opportunity. If Masonry is a school for morality and virtue, why exclude all females from participation in its benefits? He also goes on to explain that, exclusion of any type of people is problematic, and that the secrecy of the Freemasons is troubling when you think about sort of the necessity of a transparent government. Many historians speculate that also the Freemasons in their bylaws prohibited participation in their group by quote unquote cripples. And so many folks have speculated that perhaps Stevens was particularly incensed by that. I think I've already shown you this quote, but it sort of comes up again here as you're starting to see Stevens in his whole personality and adulthood take shape. In 1842, he moved to Lancaster City to South Queen Street, where the Stevens and Smith site now is. He did this because he was actually a very successful lawyer in Gettysburg, but he was a less successful businessman. He invested in a lot of real estate, which was ultimately a decent investment, but he also invested in businesses, including iron businesses, and those were less successful, at least on a short-term basis. So by the time he moved to Lancaster, he was in considerable debt. And he came from a town like Gettysburg, which is the town that you saw in the previous slide, to the cosmopolitan, sophisticated, bustling city of Lancaster that had a very early train line running through it, that had developing industry, that had a large courthouse and a lot of legal foundations, businesses, markets, travelers coming through from east to west and vice versa. So this was a place where an ambitious lawyer like Stevens could set up shop and potentially make some money, which is exactly what he did. And by the time he moved here in 1842, he was 50 years old. So just to put into context that he's relatively fully formed by this period of his life and is at this point starting to court more lofty ambitions. He would like to have a seat in federal politics and be sort of elevate his status as a politician, as a lawyer, and as a citizen, so to speak. Um, People always ask about kind of his friends and his daily life, and we know a little bit about that, not a ton, because Stevens wasn't overly friendly, uh, but he did have some good friends who were his law partners, often served as law partners to him, um, including this guy, O.J. Dickey, who practiced law in his law office, were partners with him and often followed him. Like O.J. Dickey ended up succeeding Stevens in the U.S. Congress after Stevens' death. So he was a mentor to a lot of younger lawyers. And I'll just go back to the other slide. Let's see. He was a mentor to younger lawyers like these guys. One of them is O.J. Dickey. He also was a mentor to Simon Stevens, no relation, Edward McPherson, who also ended up becoming part of the U.S. Congress. So he really did do his own part to educate a new generation of guys. And he moved into this house that you see on the screen. This is an 1881 sketch, so it's a little bit later. He moved here in he moved into the house or bought the house in 43, but you get the sense. He then did achieve his goal of being elected as the representative for the 9th Congressional District here to U.S. Congress. He served for a period. He then stopped serving. He had a break from Congress for a variety of reasons, including the fact that he wasn't renominated. Because he opposed the Compromise of 1850, which was a very pro-Southern, pro-slavery compromise. Um, and then he ultimately went back to Congress as a member of this brand new political party called the Republicans in 1859. He cared a lot about the law and about public participation in the law. He believed that participation in democracy and in lawmaking, whether by electing representatives or by being a representative, was the only way that we could achieve the vision of our country's founders and become, the democratic republic that we claimed to be. So it was important to him to represent people as a representative, as an elected representative, and to fight for the people that he represented. And it was important to him to hold others to the same standard, which he did all the time and usually without much tact. He made many, many enemies in Congress, and he was a bit of a jerk to a lot of them. But all for a good cause, really. He was pretty much always on the right side of history, in my opinion. So, you know, maybe not the best way to get achieve your goals, but that's how he did. Um, of course, one of the fundamental beliefs that Stevens had was against slavery, and it'll be another, topic of a lunch and learn or some other time when we can talk more about slavery and freedom in Pennsylvania and about Stevens' relationship with slavery, and kind of the way that he came to some of his beliefs. But you've already learned that he, valued equality, democracy, and so naturally, being an abolitionist and wanting freedom for enslaved people is not a stretch to understand. He was very anti-slavery from a relatively early time in his career, and dedicated a large part of his legal career to both defending enslaved people or freedom seekers when he was a lawyer, as a private lawyer, and also pushing for emancipation uh, at the federal level. This is a letter that we just got donated to us in the last week or two, and it is a wonderful example of how terrible Stevens' handwriting is and how hard it is to be a scholar who studies Thaddeus Stevens, because this is actually pretty good for Stevens' handwriting. But this is a really fun letter. It's a letter to Joseph Gibbons, who was a Quaker abolitionist from Bird in Hand in the eastern part of Lancaster County. Joseph Gibbons had written to Stevens when Stevens was a member of Congress. Stevens advocated, was a really active part of pushing for emancipation in Washington, D.C., because he said, Washington, D.C. doesn't have a state government. Therefore, the federal Congress is responsible for abolishing slavery within the District of Columbia. And so he really spearheaded the decision to finally abolish slavery in the District of Columbia by an act of Congress. And he did that in 1862. And just after that happened, Joseph Gibbons from Lancaster County is writing to him saying, good job on Washington, D.C. But when is the rest of the nation going to get there? What's going on with Lincoln? Why isn't Lincoln abolishing slavery immediately within the nation? And also Joseph Gibbons writes to Stevens, I hope you'll run for senator next, not just congressman. And basically, I'll help you get the votes from sort of my friends, as long as you commit to doing everything you can for abolition. And Stevens writes back, he says, yes, I'd like to run for Senate. And also, as to future hopes, they are poor as Lincoln is nobody. So what he's saying there is to Joseph Gibbons, don't get your hopes up about abolition in the entire nation, because Lincoln just isn't going far enough, and he is kind of sucking on this issue. And this is in 1862. I mean, this is the war, during the war. Stevens is chair of the House Ways and Means Committee in Congress, and sort of able to influence Lincoln to some degree. And I think this letter really demonstrates that Gibbons and other radicals from Lancaster County and from the Ninth District are pushing Stevens, and Stevens is in turn pushing Lincoln to get closer and closer to total abolition of slavery, which he eventually does. That BFF, O.J. Dickey, also wrote about Stevens that his opposition to slavery never altered with party connection and was never based upon any type of political concerns. He was always in advance of his party, his state, and his constituents. And basically, he wasn't afraid to make enemies because he believed so strongly in the cause against slavery. And he was very steadfast and radical in that belief. After the Civil War, he became even more radical, really, or let his radical flag fly. Perhaps he was already that radical, but this was an opportunity for him to really be even more so. He believed strongly that the only way that we were ever going to create a just and equal nation was to essentially burn it down and rebuild it from the ground up. And especially in the South, both physically and metaphorically. The South was in ruins after the Civil War, and Stevens wanted to destroy the Southern society, the Southern economy. He wanted to take land from the richest, like 3% of Southern slaveholders and elite Southern plantation owners and give it to freed people in a plan that is commonly understood as 40 acres and a mule. He felt that it was totally correct and, in fact, urgently needed that the US government would treat the Confederacy, the former Confederacy, as a conquered enemy and, not admit them back into the nation until they complied with a lot of these uh, wishes. The whole fabric of Southern society must be changed, and never can it be done if this opportunity is lost. Without this, the government can never be, as it never has been, a true republic. Um, he didn't quite get what he wanted, and was highly disappointed by really a lot of that, but he was able to spearhead a Civil Rights Act in 1866 that went towards establishing citizenship and equal protection under the law. He pushed in the last years of his life to turn this act into a constitutional amendment because he understood that the only way it would ever stick is if it were enshrined in the Constitution. These are some quotes from Stevens on a speech he gave pushing for the 14th Amendment. He's essentially saying that these are all guarantees in our Declaration of Independence that our forefathers didn't have the political capital to make good on. But now we can and we must if we ever really want a true republic. And we have to do it within the Constitution, or the second the former Confederates are let back in the government, they will burn it all down. A law is just not enough. And those ideas are really important and still relevant, today. So the 14th Amendment is certainly the sort of crowning achievement of Stevens' legacy, and built on a long history, as I hope you've seen, of pushing for equality, freedom, and democracy. At the very end of his life, when Stevens was so old and sick, he had to be carried into Congress on a chair. He was instrumental in the impeachment of President Andrew Johnson, who came after Lincoln. Andrew Johnson really disappointed Stevens and many radical Republicans who thought that they might be able to finally get somewhere with Lincoln and achieve some of the goals of Reconstruction that they wanted. And then once Johnson came to power, they realized very quickly that their dream of really a more perfect union would not succeed. So he, in his dying breath, led the impeachment for Andrew Johnson. And Andrew Johnson was impeached, but ultimately it was not confirmed. And so Stevens essentially died just really pissed and believing that a lot of his life's work was a failure. He as many of you know who are local to Lancaster, is buried in Trinard Concord Cemetery because he did have a plot in Woodward Hill Cemetery, one of the other fancy new cemeteries in Lancaster where James Buchanan is buried. But he realized that their charter rules only allowed white people to be buried there. So he decided to go with a cemetery that allowed both white and Black people to be buried. And he wrote his own epitaph that's etched into the grave marker at his site that you can still see today. One of the more famous quotations from Stevens. I repose in this quiet and secluded spot, not from any natural preference for solitude, but finding other cemeteries limited as to race, I have chosen this, that I might illustrate in my death the principles which I advocated through a long life. Equality of man before the Creator. A very powerful statement. And even in death, Stevens was sort of taunting people to move forward and be more radical than they might feel comfortable doing. So That's a little bit about Stevens, and here's a lightning round on Lydia Hamilton Smith. Uh, Lydia Hamilton Smith was a fascinating and powerful woman. She was Stephen's housekeeper, which in the 19th century meant something different than I think probably our modern brains think it does. It meant the manager of his household, somebody who hires and fires servants, who pays household bills, who plans menus, and who manages the sort of comings and goings of people in their household. So um, doing this, especially for a politician, a powerful politician, and especially for a bachelor who didn't have a wife to do any of the roles, was a highly public, visible, and important position. And that's what Lydia Hamilton Smith did while she worked for Siemens. And she was a mixed race woman who was both a woman and a mixed race person during a period when both of those classes were not protected by the Constitution, and she faced many, many barriers that she overcame. Ultimately, she died a very wealthy and influential woman. So how did that happen? Well, she was born here at Russell Tavern, and this is not Lydia standing in front of Russell Tavern. This is, in fact, the tavern keeper's daughter, who Lydia would have been raised alongside, at least to some degree. But she was born at Russell Tavern outside of Gettysburg. And this is, as she said, the very house that President James Buchanan's father, when he first came from Ireland to America, he arrived in Philadelphia, and he was cousins with the tavern keeper, Joshua Russell. And so Joshua Russell went to Philly and picked him up on horseback from the ship and brought him back to Russell Tavern. And so this is where James Buchanan's father got his start also. Joshua Russell held enslaved people, was a slaveholder. Russell died before Lydia Smith was born, but his son Samuel inherited his property, including his enslaved property. And then actually the son Samuel died a year later, but the son Samuel's wife, Jane Russell, remarried a man named Enoch Hamilton, and together they ran the Russell Tavern during Lydia's lifetime. And they did indeed have enslaved people working at the Russell Tavern when Lydia was born. There's no sense, or we don't believe that Lydia was born to an enslaved woman. In all likelihood, she was born to a free woman of color who worked at Russell Tavern, who is known in some accounts as Mrs. O'Neill, but never given a first name. But we don't know very much about Lydia's parentage and childhood for a variety of complicated reasons, some of which I'll address briefly in a minute. In 1834, she married a Black musician and barber named Jacob Smith. This is an image of Frank Johnson, who was a very early Black brass band leader in Philadelphia. And he is sort of the guy that it seems that Jacob Smith was modeling himself after. Jacob Smith was also a Black brass band leader in Harrisburg, and was a very notable member of the Black community, first in Gettysburg and then in Harrisburg. And so Lydia marries Jacob, known as Jake. They have two sons at some point, and then she leaves him. She leaves her marriage to Jacob Smith. This is an obituary of Jacob Smith, but he did not die until 1852, the end of 1852, and she left him in probably 1844. So she did a very rare and interesting thing, which is leave her husband and take her sons with her. And all we know is that Mr. Smith's obituary says that he was very unfortunate in his domestic relations. So, the speculation is that perhaps Lydia was a victim of domestic violence and sort of fled from Jacob Smith. When she did that, she came to Lancaster City, where she got a job working with Thaddeus Stevens as his housekeeper. This is actually across the street from, this is on Vine Street, where the words that say circa 1844 are. That corner is the Stevens and Smith site, and this is looking across Vine Street, um, almost at that time period in the 1860s. So as I mentioned, Smith worked for Stevens. She was, by all accounts, a very good cook. She managed menus and cooked. Not all housekeepers did, but she did. She was a very good cook. And she also genuinely managed the household. And as this obituary of her, a quote from her obituary says, she came in contact with many great men and was able to kind of wheel and deal in politics and in society in a way that was relatively rare for women, let alone mixed race women. She was part of St. Mary's Catholic Church and had her own community there, but she also was friends with people in the Black community in Lancaster and Stephen's white friends and their wives. And she worked for Stevens from 1844, both in Lancaster and in Washington, D.C., when his profession required him to go to D.C. for long periods of time. Just to get into a little tiny taste of the speculation, there was always speculation during Stevens and Smith's lifetimes that they were in a relationship. She was often compared to the woman that you see on your screen, Julia Chin, who was the sort of common law wife of Richard M. Johnson, a congressman in the 1830s. And very often Stevens and Smith are juxtaposed with Johnson and Chin as kind of this, white politician in a common law marriage with a woman of color. We don't know that that was the case with Stevens and Smith, but certainly it was the speculation at the time. After Stevens died, he left her a good amount of money, and she actually bought his house, the house that is part of the Stevens and Smith Center. But she also moved to Washington, D.C. at the same time. She owned that property and many others in Lancaster. She moved to D.C. and operated a boarding house on DC's Newspaper Row, a very posh, important street in Washington, 14th Street Northwest, where she operated a boarding house that catered to, as one newspaper put it, it was genteel lodgings for gentlemen. And she had politicians and legislators living with her. She also was a member in DC of St. Augustine's Catholic Church, which was a Black Catholic congregation. And she was very generous, by all accounts, with her money and her skills, and often seems to have been involved in that church community and kind of supporting other women in particular. So I don't have as many great quotes from Lydia as I do from Stevens, and we can talk about why another time, but here are the kind of documents that she appears in on a very basic level. She appears in several censuses under her own name, and the first one being the 1860 census. Prior to that, in 1850, doesn't seem that she's there. I mean, just overlooked or whatever. But here her race is identified as mulatto, which is a historical term for mixed race, what we now would call mixed race or multiracial. And she also is seen to own a small amount of real estate, which was at least partly a piece of Stevens' property that is still part of the Stevens and Smith Center. In 1870, she is only 6 years older, which is impossible. So there's a lot of question about her age and what year she was born. But here she is in 1870 in Washington, D.C., operating a boarding house. Here she's identified as white. And underneath her is actually her son, Isaac, who is also identified as white, which is really puzzling because by all accounts, he was quite dark black. Here she is in 1880, now identified again as mulatto, and now 55. So in 20 years, she's aged 11 years. So who knows what her true age was. There's lots of reasons why it might be one or the other. And here she's saying her mother and father were both born in Pennsylvania, as was she. And then one more, her death certificate. Here, the person who the official who's filling out the death certificate puzzles over her race. Was she black? Was she white? Ultimately, there's a question mark. And he also seems to indicate something other than what the census indicates, which is that her father was a native of Ireland and her mother was a native of Pennsylvania. So we really don't know. Um, what we do know about Stevens and Smith is that they were both incredibly generous and charitable. And so I thought I would just close out by asking you to consider sort of supporting their legacy by making a donation or as you can to the Stevens and Smith Center so that we can continue their work and support their legacy. O.J. Dickey said Stevens was incapable of saying no and was very lavish in his private charity. And the newspaper upon Smith's death said she was generous to a fault and could never resist an appeal for help. So we hope you will consider that. Okay, I know there's some questions, so I'll stop sharing and let Emily and Robin guide me. And I'm introducing Robin Surratt, our president and CEO of Lancaster History, who will join me in the Q&A also.
I'm going to start quoting Stevens and Smith in that charitable introduction. Stephanie, thank you for that. Because as Stephanie and Emily and all of you on the Zoom know, we're knee deep in a capital campaign for this project. So we've been asking a lot of people a lot of questions involving their support. So we're grateful to everyone who's been able to step up and be part of this project. So we're happy to take some questions now. I was thinking I might take the first one I saw, and Stephanie, you can hop in there with me. The question was whether we can explain why Lydia Hamilton Smith's name merits equal billing with Thaddeus Stevens on the building itself, which is a great question, and it's a really interesting one that a number of people have asked from different vantage points. There's a couple of rationales that I have to that end. One is logistics. Lydia Hamilton Smith owned the building. Thaddeus Stevens owned the building. Lydia Hamilton Smith owned it for 11 years, where Stevens owned it for 24, but she actually lived in it longer than he did. You go to a lot of historic sites, and they're often named for the people whose residencies were most important during the occupation periods that are focused in interpretation. And she decidedly earns that right just by virtue of her property ownership, which I think in itself is also a really interesting part of her story. It would be an interesting question to ask if we had no Thaddeus Stevens at this site, would we be creating a museum exclusively about Lydia Hamilton Smith? I think there's an argument to be made that with whatever information we had, we certainly would be doing something to tell her story and share her legacy. She's a remarkable woman doing really interesting and unusual things for her time. And because of her relationship with Stevens, it's just a more unique story than most women then or now would have been able to experience and spin out. I think also the Stevens and Smith nature of the center is really important in that they were instrumental in one another's lives. Without Stevens, I doubt Lydia Hamilton Smith would have begun the process of entering into so many property purchases. My assumption is that she learned some of the tricks of that trade from him, and that they were sort of mutually it was a symbiotic relationship where they're each learning from one another. There's a lot of documentation about how in the last 6, 8 years of Stephen's life, he was getting most of his caretaking directly from Lydia Hamilton Smith and almost exclusively from her, along with his doctor. And without her, therefore, he wouldn't have survived to really reach the height of his political legacy, which reshaped the nation. So I think actually the Stevens and Smith story is probably the best logic for why they are in it together. Their stories are so dependent on one another, and also they're not adjunct to each other. I think her story is worthy and valuable in and of itself. So those are my responses to that answer or to that question. Stephanie, I don't know if you want to add anything else. All right.
All right, so we have another question in the chat. So were Stevens and Smith portrayed accurately in Spielberg's Lincoln? Or is it conjecture?
So Stevens, as sort of his personality and overall aura. I think it's portrayed quite accurately by Tommy Lee Jones. He was full of witticisms, of sort of he was brash and relatively unpleasant, I think, to be around most of the time. And in that way, I think that's very accurate. In terms of the relationship between Stevens and Smith, the Lincoln film portrays Stevens and Smith sharing a bed in their home. That is obviously conjecture. We have no evidence that that was ever true. It is a great way to make a Hollywood film, and I probably would have made the same choice. That certainly ups the drama and adds a little scandal and intrigue to Stephen's biography. But ultimately, we have no way of knowing, whether or not Stevens and Smith shared a bed, let alone anything else. So.
Looks
All
like the
right.
next question. Oh, go ahead, Emily. All right.
Yes, I shall be your moderator.
You be our moderator. We'll wait.
So the next question is, have you come across any surprising findings either on Stevens or Smith during your research or the efforts to create the center? Maybe something that made you go, oh, wow, I didn't know that.
Limitless, and I think we could dedicate an entire lunch and learn just to discoveries. Stephanie, I'll let you think about some that might be specific to Stevens and Smith. From my end, some of the things that have been most remarkable include the details related to some of the people who came through Lancaster County on the Underground Railroad seeking assistance. And why that's surprising is because it's very hard to find documentation about those stories. But as we've been unraveling some of our research, and actually as the project has become better known, people are coming forward with documentation that actually once linked kind of one to the next, story to story. We're starting to create this this sort of network of kinship among individuals who either knew each other during their terms of enslavement in Maryland or met each other then here in Lancaster County, and whose stories then continue on in different parts of the historical record. And we might not have known those connections if it weren't for some of these really remarkable one-off documents, some of which are literally a page. And because of the references, it helps us start to imagine much more clearly who knew each other in the moments when they were arriving in Lancaster County in the 1840s and 50s.
Yeah, I mean, for my part, I'll just say I think we come across new discoveries every day. This process has been just absolutely joyful and incredible, because I think we are just to be able to dedicate so much time to sort of research and creating this new space. We've also been able to dedicate time to really piecing apart historical mysteries in a way that's really exciting. In terms of something related to Stevens and Smith, I've gotten to know them both better as humans, and I come to really like them. Even even Stevens, I think he was kind of a jerk, but like a cool jerk who I would totally want to hang out with anyway, and very generous to his friends. A surprising fact about Smith is that, she was extremely wealthy, made a lot of her own wealth, and some of it came from real estate investment, which I think Stevens, as Robin said, kind of gave Lydia kind of pointers and got her start in real estate. But another business that she created on her own essentially was when they were in Washington, D.C., even before Stevens died. Lydia used her own money to buy some horses and carriages and start a business that chauffeured people, like essentially a taxi business that took people around Washington, D.C. And even Stevens was a customer of the business. And in one of her obituaries, it actually says that is where she made quite a lot of wealth, especially during the war, because so many single men are coming to Washington on business, on political business and whatnot, that aren't bringing with them vehicles. They're coming, especially during this period, on the train. And so being able to rent a horse and carriage, especially these sort of wealthy, powerful men, is really something special. So I've been very surprised at how much money Lydia made on her own accord by businesses like that.
I think you've also, Stephanie, done a lot of research more recently about Lydia's son, Isaac.
Yeah.
And one of the questions was related to descendants, which I don't know if you want to touch on that, but some of your research about Isaac has been pretty, I think, interesting and unusual.
Yeah, I mean, I hate to say it's the one of the most interesting things about Lydia, because it's not actually about, I mean, it's her son, so I guess she takes some credit for him. But learning more about her son, she had two sons, but one of them, one son died as a young man. The other son lived a bit longer, and his name was Isaac Smith. He was called Ike, and he was a barber and a musician in Lancaster. And his story will certainly have to be the topic of another lunch and learn, but really, really fascinating person. And in terms of descendants, he did have a son, but a daughter who died in childhood, and then a son who unfortunately died as a young man before he could have his own children. So that's the end of sort of the direct line from Lydia.
Great. Did Lydia attend Stephen's funeral? And if she did she have any specific role in that?
She definitely did attend, and she was part of the procession. There's a great image that appears, I think, in Frank Leslie's newspaper of the gravesite that it seems pretty probable that one of the people depicted among the crowd really looks like it's probably Lydia. So we have a sense of even kind of where she stood, and she was treated, Stevens left money to Lydia in his will, in addition to leaving money to his surviving nephew and lots of other people and charities, but certainly she was treated as, a member of the family, really. He also had other household staff that attended his funeral. She was not the only person from his domestic staff. She was at his deathbed when he died, as was his very loyal body man called Lewis West, and a handful of other domestic servants who were there when Stevens died and very likely attended the funeral.
She also left her own bequest in her will to ensure the care and management of Stephen's tomb after her death. And that fund actually still exists.
Yes.
Great. What parts of Stevens and Smith's stories are most challenging to tell? Is it the lack of documentation that makes things difficult? Is there conflicting evidence? Like one example was like her age, Lydia's age on various documents makes it difficult. Are there any more things that just kind of are difficult to tell in their stories?
History mysteries.
I mean, as I'm sure Mark Kelly would tell you, who wrote the book of the most recent book on Lydia, that everything about Lydia is challenging, and it's no accident in terms of why it's so much harder to learn her story than to learn Thaddeus Stevens' story. It's because she was, born, a poor woman of color in a time period where those people's records were not generally valued or kept in things like archives. A lot of Stevens papers are at the Library of Congress. Her papers are not, anywhere. So yes, everything from her race to who her parents were to why she left her marriage to all the decisions she made basically are somewhat remain a mystery to some degree, and of course the most challenging thing in terms of interpreting Stevens and Smith for the general public, I think, is interpreting their relationship with one another, is finding the right balance of acknowledging the speculation and some indication that they were, I mean, certainly without a doubt, they were dear friends. They became, that they were employer and employee who became dear friends. They cared very much about one another, and whether or not they had a relationship that went past the point of a deep friendship is, uncertain. But that is certainly the most challenging thing to unpack, because it's very hard to say I don't know on a museum panel, and it's a very complex topic.
And I think about both of them, but Stevens in particular, one of the challenges, of course, like with all Underground Railroad activists, it's very hard to tell stories about something that was intentionally based off of subterfuge. So, we have a few documented moments of Stevens engaging in illegal activity related to what we would consider the Underground Railroad. There's just not a lot of documentation about it. So we have to pull together threads of how other people chose to talk about his experiences after his death, or about how other, as I said, some of these other documents that help indicate who came to Lancaster at what time and who they were receiving assistance from. We do have a couple of key references to Stevens that obviously flag his uh, willingness to participate in the subterfuge of the Underground Railroad. But it would be great if there was just this lovely diary that said, and today we did this, and then the next day we did that. So a lot of this is, I think, and I hope, something that we will continue to learn more and more about. Research is forever ongoing. So this is the problem with creating a museum, unlike writing a series of articles or something that you can then update very regularly, is we will have words on walls, we'll have images on walls, we'll tell stories in the outset. And then over the course of the next, 5 years, new discoveries will come to light, and we'll need to find ways that we can update the content in the center, because we will continue to learn more, which is part of why we keep doing this.
Great. And there was a question that came in chat, and I think Stephanie answered it, but it went to just the host. So I will make sure you all know, did items about Lydia Smith appear in the Black newspapers in Washington, D.C.? And Stephanie just, shot off a quick reply that said, yes, to some degree. Lydia is mentioned a handful of times, especially in relation to St. Augustine's Church, and her obituary was widely run in all newspapers, both black and white. So that was a great question. I just want to make sure everybody
And she
knew.
made a lot of social registers in newspapers throughout the country. So she's actually showing up with some frequency. It is interesting to find all of the sources in which Lydia Smith shows up on her own, and not just as a connection to Thaddeus Stevens. Mm-hmm.
Well, thank you all so much for your questions. I know we didn't get to probably everyone today, but we're hoping to offer more sessions, at least similar to this, in the future, and especially the one in May at Southern Market. So if you found this really interesting and want to learn, please make sure you register for that. And thanks for coming. But I'll turn it over to Robin. Any final remarks?
Yes, and while I'm thanking everybody, if you'll just throw in the chat the Stevens and Smith Center website and our contact information.
Sure.
You're all connected to us in one way or another. You know where to find us, but please don't hesitate to reach out. We are always interested in hearing from you about what you hope for at the center. As Stephanie said, with her lovely segue about Stevens and Smith's philanthropy to ongoing efforts to raise funds, we're always looking for support, and we would love to have yours in this project. Our giving range for this project is $4 to $4 million. So it doesn't have to be, this enormous life-changing gift for it to be a project-changing gift. We'd just love to have you be part of this. And again, with all of the events coming up, there's lots of opportunity for you to come out and see the center. We really hope you'll come visit it. We will be in exhibition fabrication mode for the next year. So we still hope to open about a year from now. And meanwhile, we'll keep you posted and updated through the historian, through bookmarks, if you're a member, and through the website. So please stay in touch and follow along with our progress. And thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you all, and we'll see you soon. Have a great Friday and a great weekend. Bye.